Welcome back, listener, to season 2 of the Inspired Writer Collective podcast. As you may have known, we took some time off in December to start planning for this second season. I've got a number of great guest episodes that'll be coming your way that I've already been recording. And this is our first episode of the new season in the new year. I am here with Stephanie, my co-host, and today we're going to be talking about intrinsic motivation for writers. And a lot of this conversation comes around the book Drive by Daniel H. Pink. So this is a book that I read towards the end of 2024, and then Stephanie read it within the past few weeks. But it's a topic I've wanted to bring to this podcast for a while because so many of these online writing programs, even ones that I've participated in, use that external punishment or reward system, or as we will refer to as carrot or stick method, in order to coerce yourself into getting your writing done. So that can look like a lot of different ways, and we'll spend the first couple of minutes talking about why that can be so detrimental to your writing process. And then the rest of the time, we're going to shift focus to the intrinsic motivation, the source that inspiration needs to be coming from in order to be sustainable. And there are 3 key elements that Daniel Pink goes into in the book in order to tap into and foster intrinsic motivation. That is autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And while I think many writers feel a deep sense of purpose in their writing and maybe even autonomy, especially if you're self-publishing or you're not having to follow a really strict structure, that mastery piece is an area we're going to really dig into in our conversation today because there's some awareness we need to have as writers about the way that we develop as writers and that it takes time. And so that's where our conversation's going to go today. So thank you for joining us here today, and thank you for coming back for season 2. So to kick it off, when we talk about like the carrot and stick model, those external factors, in so much of our day-to-day, that's what's used. Stephanie, I know you can speak to like the metrics and the punishments and reward systems that you experienced in the school system. I certainly experienced this with our quotas and things when we were talking in the forensic lab about getting our casework done. And it's just not very motivating. And at some point, even if you are bringing some intrinsic motivation to the job, like you feel a sense of purpose, as you lose that autonomy, as you lose the ability to make your own decisions or to complete a project with the people you want to complete it with or how you want to complete it, then a lot of that motivation falls off and then it becomes like you're just, having to force yourself. To kind of go back to, and I've talked about this before on the podcast, the initial way that I started writing my memoir was doing this like 30-day email course. And one of the very first things that the course had you do was set up a punishment for yourself if you did not complete the like writing assignment within the 30 days. And you were encouraged to do something really that you would not want to give up as a way to self-motivate. And so I remember coming up with this concept that I was going to have to give up coffee for a week if I didn't finish this project because I knew I would end up with caffeine headaches. I knew that I would be miserable and that would be enough to keep me motivated to, complete the writing tasks. But now after reading this book, after seeing all the research that backs the detriment of external motivators and the benefits of the intrinsic motivation, I can see that this approach is absolutely the wrong way to go.
Well, and it's so interesting that, just all the things you're saying, because especially when I think about my experience in the school system is there's so much around my time in the classroom as a teacher that was incentive based or, do these things or else, you're not going to get your performance goal for the year on the statewide performance metrics that they have. And I think it's why, unfortunately, we're seeing so many teachers who are burning out in the classroom because they're feeling like they're just not able to have that autonomy, because a lot of teachers, in the same way as writers, are very creative people. And that's part of what draws them into teaching. You have creative ideas that you want to share with your students. and it leads to such burnout. And then my other thought too, as I was reading this book, especially about this carrot and stick, was just, is this why writer's block happens? That we set these expectations for ourselves, or like you said, you had a set a punishment. I mean, that just sounds absolutely horrible. And but so many of us are wanting to think like, oh, okay, this person has the next best fix for us, or this one. And then we set those unrealistic expectations, and then we just become disappointed when in fact it's already within us to meet our goals if we allow for ourselves to have the space for creativity.
Right. And there's a place for these kind of factors. Like the book highlights that routine work can be outsourced or automated. But when you're trying to do something artistic, empathetic, or non
Hmm.
routine, meaning there's not a distinct endpoint that you are trying to get to, then this kind of motivator is actually demotivating, like any kind of
Hmm.
external motivator. Um, so the intrinsic motivation that we're going to be talking about is the drive to do something because it is interesting, challenging, or absorbing. And when we talk about being intrinsically motivated, that's when this terminology of flow comes into play a lot of times, where you lose that sense of time, where you're engrossed in the task at hand, where it's sort of this like you're sort of on the hamster wheel where your action is creating more action and creating more motivation to keep going, and you just get to be and to play. Um and so that's what we're going to be talking about, is like the how do we tap into that, and why is it so important, especially in a creative endeavor like writing. We can't use the same sort of tactics of routine work unless you want a routine outcome. And by that, I mean the exact same book as someone else, without your voice, without your style, without any of your own creative input. I mean, essentially, that's like using AI to write your book. That would
Hmm.
be an example of using these sort of routine, structured, outsourced, automated ways to write. And that's not going to produce good creative work.
Well, and I think it's really important to think about how so often we want to fit ourselves into certain structures because we think that that's what's going to make it work for us. And ultimately, with this idea of intrinsic motivation, it's about figuring out what works for you. And that can be very challenging because if what works for you isn't what you're seeing out there on the greater, internet and reels and all those things that are in your face at all times, if you're on social media, you begin to doubt yourself like, oh, well, maybe my process isn't what's working. But really, if it's working for you, then it's working. And if it's getting you to write and if it's getting you to show up, however it is that you show up. And I mean, we've talked in previous podcast episodes of so many different ways that you can show up. And it's really about figuring out what works for you.
I was really surprised too by the research that they've done and the studies that they've done that show that adding an extrinsic reward on top of something you're already motivated to do, on top of something that already interests you, actually dampens your motivation and your performance. So it's like, say you're already motivated to write and you build in, I know I did this, I built in like rewards, like points. So like I said, well, once I get through this round of editing, I'm going to treat myself to a spa day. Once I, get my book to beta readers, I'm going to do this thing for myself and as a reward. And what their studies have shown is that when they add some sort of external motivator or reward for just a job well done on something that you're already motivated to do, it actually kills your motivation. And that was something that was so surprising to me, and something I wanted to be aware of for myself and also share with others, because I think we do want to reward ourselves for a job well done. And I had no idea that mentally what's going on in your mind that could actually set you back and keep you from achieving what it is that you're trying to achieve, simply because you put an external reward on it.
Yeah, no, I found that really fascinating too, because I think that culturally there's so much around having those external rewards, like you said. I mean, you hear so many people talk about, well, do this and then you get this. And it's the same thing, we know as parents, there's so many different ways of parenting. And there's often been well, if your kids do this, then they should get this. And I love this whole notion of surprising someone with a reward, or, maybe as a writer, you have an unexpected recognition. And so it's like, oh, wow, I had no idea that was going to happen. And really you can almost feel the energy burst. I think in my own brain right now, I feel this like surge, like, oh, okay, I didn't expect that to happen. And it is that motivating place. And it makes me think about the whole idea of like life begins at the end of your comfort zone, that when you push yourself to that point, that like, then all of a sudden you get this kick of energy and you're like, oh, wow. And so, yeah, I think we've seen it too when we've had days where we're like, wow, we sat down and wrote, oh my goodness, I wrote 1,000 words, I wrote 1,500 words. And we didn't even set those goals for ourselves. But when we've reached those, I think there's even more push to keep saying, oh, wow, like I can do this.
Yeah, I was going to say that's how I felt when we saw our sort of Buzzsprout podcast hosting results for the end of 2024. We saw how many episodes, what kind of reach we had. I mean, that was a reward for me, but that was not what we were chasing, right? We weren't doing it for that outcome. We were simply showing up and continue to show up because we just love doing the work. The other thought I kept having as I was reading about these like external factors and how they are so detrimental to like turning what would have been play into work is also this idea of like side hustles in our culture nowadays, about how you have to turn every sort of interest or whatever, like, oh, well, why don't you sell it for money? Why don't you, like, why don't you that become a side business? Well, if you like to crochet, turn that into a thing. If you like to write, turn that into a thing. And just this kind of caution of like, not everything has to be a thing. I remember feeling that in high school because I loved working backstage. I loved doing like the stagecraft, the tech side, the lighting design. And people asked me like, oh, do you want to major in that in college? And I was like, no, because I knew like the minute I turned it into a job, something I was doing as a trade-off for money, that like I would not enjoy it. I still did it in college as I volunteered and I signed up to work shows and it stayed fun and it's still something I love, but I just knew that it would diminish my enjoyment of it if I had to do it.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's so true. And I can think of several people I know who, turned something that they loved that was a hobby, where it was baking or, their music or something of that nature. And it just led to really quick burnout. And I think, as writers, we, of course, we want to make money. We want to sell our books. But that really is not the overarching purpose of why we're sitting down to write. And I think that that's the key point to distinguish here is that as writers, we are showing up because our purpose is bigger than, oh, I want to go be a New York Times bestselling author. That is an amazing goal. And if that's your goal, awesome. But that's not the driving force for everyone who shows up to write. And I think that it's important to remember that some people are hobby writers and they're doing it for fun. Others, it is their main source of income. They've learned how to make it that way for themselves. And they're still showing up because there's the greater purpose of loving it.
I love this part in the book. And it was talking about painters and sculptors who were intrinsically motivated, those for whom the joy of discovery and the challenge of creation were their own rewards, were able to weather the tough times and the lack of recognition that inevitably accompany artistic careers. And I definitely see that. Like when the reward is the fact that you've got those 1,500 words down, when the reward itself is just completion of your edits or completion of a chapter or getting your book into those first readers' hands, then that's what's going to help you weather the times where you're not getting any sort of external feedback. When you feel like you're just in a room by yourself, how are you going to keep going if you're not getting all those external pieces? Well, it comes from that intrinsic motivation. And the book even says, like, it's not that setting goals are bad, but the goals should be revolving around attaining mastery, not
Mhm.
about receiving a particular like accolade. Even the New York Times bestseller, like, is it really that you want that accolade, or is it a deeper, like, you just want to have reached that level where your readers are so appreciative of the work that you've put out that it's reaching a wide audience because of the quality that you've put out? I think if most people are honest with themselves, it's less about the actual title and it's more about just what that means, about what level of mastery you've reached. And so maybe then if you reframe your goal, it's less about whether you appear on a particular list and more about what kind of feedback you're getting from your readers and how your book sales are going and just things like that.
Well, and I think too, I mean, one of the pieces in the book is about so much around mastery as a mindset, and that it's about creating and building those beliefs in ourselves based on our experiences and encouraging and seeing that, okay, I did this. Oh, wow. How did that make me feel? And how it changes your perspective about yourself. Whereas I think with the extrinsic piece, if you're constantly trying to meet certain goals and you're not meeting those, your belief system is and your mindset is not going to be in the right place to encourage the creativity that comes with intrinsic motivation.
Yeah, take NaNoWriMo as an example. Like, you could have two different writers coming into that with two different intentions, right? One may be saying, like, they're just totally focused on, am I going to get 50,000 words down? And then maybe hard on themselves if they don't reach that goal. Whereas another writer's coming in and just knowing that doing that level of intensive writing is going to take them out of their comfort zone and allow them to, improve their writing in ways that they hadn't before, especially with the intensity of the writing and the repetitive habit of showing up. And those two writers could get a totally different takeaway from having completed that challenge. One may view that as, oh, I'm improving my skills and I'm gaining in mastery, no matter how many of these 50,000 words I get down, whether I achieve this, extrinsic metric or not. Whereas another writer may look at their accomplishment of getting, 40,000 words down and feel like they didn't achieve what they meant to achieve without being able to have that perspective that you've gained some mastery, you've gained some skills in the process. And that's really what the focus should be on.
Well, and that goes back to what Daniel Pink writes about with the performance versus learning goals component, where, when we're constantly setting performance goals, it just can diminish the interest in showing up every day. Whereas if you're saying like, wow, I'm learning something new every day about myself, about my writing, about how I'm showing up, you're sort of more motivated. You're like, oh yeah, like I can do this. I can get in my chair and I can, do this at 6 a.m. or I can do this at 6 p.m. or whatever time it works, as opposed to saying, oh my gosh, I didn't get my 500 words today. And then you start feeling down about yourself. And I know for me that when I set those goals for myself and I don't meet them, I start to get kind of cranky and I start to get kind of snappy. And then I realize, like, wait a minute, this is not okay. I need to shift how I'm showing up because it's not fair to the people in the world around me because they don't know why I'm being maybe a little bit cranky, that I'm really sort of picking on myself internally. And that's where that mindset of like, no, look at what you did accomplish today. Like, wow. Like, when people talk about like keeping a gratitude journal and how that can help you shift your mindset, I think that that's a piece of this too, is sitting down and reminding yourself, like, look at what you achieved today. Did you read more of a book you wanted to read? Did you write more words? Did you do some more research? Did you have a conversation with someone that's going to move your manuscript forward? I mean, I was thinking yesterday, I went skiing and it was in the middle of the day and my husband's like, hey, you want to go ski with a naturalist? Because it was a program that was offered for free. I was like, well, I don't know if I really want to go, but then I was like, okay, why not? And so we went and I realized like, oh my goodness, this just added a whole new component to my own manuscript related to the ski industry and wildlife habitat that I didn't expect to have happen. But, those are things that I'm like, okay, like, yeah, I was doing something with my family and it was taking me away from sitting down at my desk. But guess what? Like, I took a leap into something that felt a little bit intimidating because I'm not a big fan of skiing in groups of people. But I was like, okay. And then it ended up being a worthwhile experience.
I love that. I want to share a little bit about flow that he mentioned in the book, that the highest, most satisfying experiences are when people are in flow. And what he kind of defines as those aspects of how to get into flow is when the goals are clear, the feedback is immediate, aka you're seeing those words added to the screen. The challenge isn't too easy. It's a notch or two beyond your current ability, such that effort is part of the reward, and you can be proud of yourself for having put in and pushed yourself a little bit. If you think about like doing a workout, like this is a very common like concept in doing a workout, like where you do one more rep or one more set or one more thing, push yourself a little bit more distance or go a little bit faster, just something beyond your current ability. Focus and satisfaction are achieved. You have a deep connection to the current moment where you're in full control. And another example is like when you're going hiking and you can see the top of the mountain, you can see the path, you can see where you have to go and what you have to do. And you can also look back behind you and see the progress that you're making along the way. You're having to exert some effort. It may not be the easiest thing. Parts may be harder than others, but you get that immediate feedback that you're making, progress. Your goal is clear. It's the peak of that mountain. And so then you can be in that flow state.
Well, and I think too, I mean, in thinking about the hiking piece too, is that maybe if you don't reach the peak of the mountain, you can still see that you've made progress.
Yes.
And like you said, it's that piece of, maybe the first time you try, you get a little bit further, and then the next time you get a little bit further. And that's one of the things that, of course, right now at this time of year, the book Atomic Habits by James Clear is very popular because it's a time where, it's the new year. Everybody starts setting goals and taking on new things for the year. And he talks about that in there, about the habit setting that, with the gym, just show up at the parking lot. That can be your first step. Then maybe you step inside and you're watching what people are doing. And it's the same idea with writing. It's like, okay, what is the next step that you can take for yourself that's going to give you that boost without having any external reward around you, that's going to give you that sense of joy, that's going to remind you of the purpose, that's going to remind you why you're showing up every day, especially, when you think about who your readers are. I mean, I know, I've shifted around with my manuscript so much, and I finally landed with YA romance. And really, I mean, there's so many reasons why, but one of them recently has been that when I've gone into bookstores and I've gone into the YA section, I just notice how dark it is. There's not a lot of just good stories. There's sort of this darkness around, the sort of the science fiction or mystery and thriller and sci-fi, just all of these pieces. And I think, I want to contribute to where there are books that for the kids who do want to read a good, feel good story and go on with their day.
Yeah, I don't think many writers struggle with purpose in their writing. And if they do, it usually weeds them out pretty early on because writing is so difficult that if you don't have a purpose bigger than yourself, if you don't have your reader in mind, I mean, I've talked plenty of times before about how I got to kind of a stopping point after I did my original version of my manuscript, how I wasn't sure if I was going to continue to pursue it because that part I had done for me, right? But when I started to think about who could benefit from it, like that's what motivates me to keep going. That's my bigger purpose. So I don't think many writers really struggle with that purpose sort of outside of themselves, or if they do, it weeds them out early. But it's this mastery piece that I just kept being reminded of because we've talked about how mastery is a mindset, but the book also talks about two other laws of mastery, and that is that mastery is a pain, and that also mastery is an asymptote, or that word sounds familiar, but you don't remember from math class back in high school. That's that curve that slowly approaches a value but never actually reaches it. And that's what so many of these authors that have been around for a long time talk about. That's what I've seen Liz Gilbert talk about. That's what I've seen all of these big people talk about, is you're always kind of approaching mastery, but you're
Mhm.
never going to actually get there. But it's your push to continue to improve, to continue to get joy from the ways in which you are improving. And what makes mastery so attractive is that it's elusive. And that's what keeps us going
Mhm.
a lot of times. And then, of course, that other piece I mentioned, that the mastery is pain. If it didn't hurt, if it wasn't hard, then more people would be doing it, you know?
So
Um,
that's
they
so that's
said
so true.
they referenced in the book, the military cadets, and how this concept of grit was actually the best predictor of whether the cadets would achieve, completion of their academy or whatever it was. And they define grit as a perseverance and passion for long-term goals. And I mean, that's something that you only really develop with time, and what is not a longer term goal than writing a full length novel? It is a long haul. And granted, there are some people who have, perfected their process and they can do it within their, 2 months or whatever. But they've gotten there because they're further along on this mastery journey than you or I are. But most people, especially those of us starting out writing our first book, it is a long journey. Stephanie, you can speak to this with your first published work.
Well, absolutely. I mean, it took me about 4 years to, work through with my first book that I published, and of course now I'm, walking into year 2 on my latest manuscript. And I mean, grit has definitely, there's a lot of research out there around how has been a really great predictor of success for a lot of people. And somebody who's written a lot about that is Angela Duckworth. And she also has a YouTube, I think a TED talk around it. And I think that they've shown how it's one of those components that they look for in people, especially in the workplace, even nowadays, for like, how much are they going to stick with something and, get through the muck and the mud to get to the other side. And it's definitely been a huge component of performance review, but in a different way, because it is that piece of who is willing to work through all the different levels to get. And like you said, you're not quite going to get to mastery, but you're pushing yourself to that place and you're constantly challenging yourself. And again, it creates that drive, like hence the title of the book. Like there is this piece inside of you, this energy boost that you will feel that aligns all of these pieces that we're talking about: the flow, the mindset, you're working through the pain. You don't care, how much you have to like wade through to get there. You are going to get there no matter what, because this is what you're meant to do.
Exactly. That really goes well into this part I wanted to emphasize from the book, that mastery often involves working and showing little improvement, perhaps with a few moments of flow pulling you along, then making a little progress, and then working on that new, slightly higher plateau again. And that's what it looks like. That's certainly what my writing has looked like. I write a bit and then I develop some new skill and then I incorporate that new skill into the way I'm continuing to write or how I edit. And then that time with the work produces a new skill and then I utilize that. And it's all like building blocks. And so if you are someone who is struggling to find motivation, for one, remove those external motivators, remove the rewards, remove the punishments, and then look at these 3 aspects of intrinsic motivation. Look at autonomy. Ask yourself, do you have control over the task, over your time, over the technique, or over your team? Those are the 4 T's of autonomy. So are you forcing yourself to write the very next chapter where you should be giving yourself a little bit more leeway because the task at hand is not something that you are particularly into, and you need to lean into that motivation of the autonomy of choosing what task is best suited for your current mental space or mood? Are you really structured in your time, but you would be better served to have a different time or a different length of time or something like that? Are you following a writing program where the technique is super rigid and you're not allowed to use your own style or your own voice? Um, and then look at purpose. Do you have a bigger purpose than yourself? Are you motivated by, something bigger than you, whether that's because you believe in the core message of your fictional work or your memoir, or, who is this for? What change do you hope to bring into the world? And then also recognizing that this is something where you're trying to develop mastery and it's a long game. And it's
Mhm.
not going to come overnight. And you're not going to feel like you've got it figured out. And frankly, you will never have it figured out. And thank God, because then everyone would be doing it. So if you're struggling in any of those ways, like do a little self check, see if any of that is, points you to where you might be hanging up on things. And maybe it'll create a little bit more space to fall into those moments of flow that are so invigorating and so rewarding. Um, and yeah, check out this book if you have any sort of questions. There's resources towards the back of the book that show how to implement some of this. Um, and I think this has been really good for me because I've been really hard on myself about not achieving my goals, quote unquote, that I set for myself. I've been hesitant to make new goals. And this book helped to validate why I was feeling hesitant and why that's probably okay that I don't have a super structured goal with, associated reward. Um, and that I'm just going to continue to keep showing up because I know that I am gaining skills. I am getting closer to mastery. Although I know I'll never get there, I can see the ways in which my writing's improved. I've seen the ways in which I've improved it from a personal development standpoint. Certainly, we can take an approach and see how we've improved as podcasters over the course of the last year. And I can extrapolate that success
Well,
in those endeavors and that consistency to my writing as well. Stephanie, what were some of your personal takeaways?
well, I think very similar to yours, just the piece of giving myself some grace around the writing process and realizing that it is a marathon and not a sprint, and that it's going to take time. And that also, I really appreciated the perspective in the book around removing all of these external pressures. And it's been really helpful, especially with the new year and following things on social media where people are like, do this or set this or make a list here and do this. And I'm thinking, I don't have to do any of that because I just have to do what works for me. And I don't have to do what works for everybody else out there. And I don't need somebody out there telling me how to do what I do because I know that what I do it well in the same way that your writing is amazing as well. And I think that that's the piece that I really come to, if we want to say like entering this new year, this new you or whatever it might be, is, you know what? I'm okay with where I am. And that in and of itself is an empowering feeling. And listener, I hope that you take from today's podcast, whatever little nuggets that will help you get closer to your writing goals and your writing dreams.
I love that, Stephanie. I think that's such a great takeaway. It's all going to happen in due time. I sat on my author website domain name for over a year. And just yesterday, I finally was motivated intrinsically, not because I set the goal, not because someone told me I had to, but I just got that push internally to finally sit down and see about starting to build the website. I fleshed out the whole thing. I'm just adding some final details to make sure all the buttons work at this point, but I feel so good about it. And so I'm getting that kind of feedback of the reward in having the website completed. Plus, I can also see how I was not ready to put those words to a page, commit those words to a website without going through this whole last year of who am I as a writer? What am I offering? What do people want to hear from me? And it's only with that knowledge and that experience I've gained through my different trials and things I've tried that I even can sit down with any sort of confidence and know that I have something I want to share and here's what I want to share. So I say that to say that there is a time and a place for probably all of that advice that we hear. And that's okay if it's not right this second.
Well, listener, we hope that you've enjoyed this episode, and we're so excited for you to join us on another season, another year of the Inspired Writer Collective podcast. Send us an email, hello@inspiredwritercollective.com. Connect with us on social media, and we hope you continue listening.